So, when we talk about the study of discourse, we're really looking at how language connects deeply with issues of equity and justice. Critical discourse analysis, or CDA, is a key method here. It aims to critically examine how social inequalities are expressed, shaped, and even challenged through the way we use language. It's about understanding that discourse isn't created in a vacuum. It both reflects and influences the social world around us. The critical approach emphasizes that discourse is shaped by social structures, but it also has the power to shape those structures in turn. It's a dynamic relationship. For example, when we talk about racism, it's not just a matter of individual prejudice. It's a form of social practice, discriminatory practices embedded in everyday communication, in texts, in talk. Racism, in this view, is a social structure of oppression that's constantly produced and reinforced by individuals in their daily interactions. Throughout this presentation, we'll see how language doesn't just reflect reality, but actively constructs and maintains social inequalities. This understanding is vital because it helps us see how discourse can be a tool both of oppression and of resistance. Let's talk about us versus them polarization. Usually, ideologies tend to organize people and society in very polarized ways. Racist ideologies, as well as other types of beliefs, are fundamentally structured around this clear division. It's this idea of an us versus them that really underpins how these ideologies function. You can see this in the language we use, the pronouns us and them. Those simple words carry a lot of weight in expressing this division. Often, ideologies emerge from conflicts or struggles between groups, where one group sees itself in opposition to another. This kind of polarization isn't just about difference. It's about power, who holds it, who seeks it, and how groups compete or cooperate. This division is actually crucial because it influences how power is exercised and maintained. It shapes behaviors around domination, resistance, and sometimes even violence. It impacts all levels of discourse, from everyday conversations to larger social and political conflicts. Now, this brings us to the in-group, out-group phenomenon. Basically, when we categorize people as part of our in-group, and contrast them with those outside it, the out-group, we reinforce this us versus them dynamic. It's a natural tendency, but it's also one that can escalate conflict or justify discrimination. Understanding this polarization helps us see how ideologies, especially harmful ones, manipulate group identities to control or influence societies. Recognizing these patterns is key to addressing the roots of division and working toward more inclusive ways of relating. Critical discourse studies, or CDS, which was traditionally known as critical discourse analysis, is essentially a problem-oriented, interdisciplinary research movement. Its main aim is to promote social equality and justice through analyzing language. The central objective here is to critically examine how language, ideology, power, and social structure are interconnected. Specifically, we want to understand how social inequality is constructed, reproduced, and legitimized through language and other modes of communication. CDS is fundamentally interested in uncovering both obvious and hidden relationships of dominance, discrimination, and control that are embedded in language. This approach helps us make sense of how language can contribute to the domination of some groups over others. And ultimately, the goal is emancipation, using this understanding to challenge and change these oppressive structures. When we talk about investigating power, ideology, and discrimination, we're really focusing on how language can serve as a tool to maintain or challenge social inequalities. By analyzing these discourses, we can better understand the mechanisms that uphold social hierarchies and look for ways to foster greater equality. So in this slide, I want to walk you through how the SCA framework connects different levels of society, specifically, how the small-scale, everyday talk relates to larger social structures of power and inequality. It does this by examining three key components. First, the discourse component focuses on the actual language used, things like topics, disclaimers, specific words, metaphors, that shape racist texts and conversations. It's about understanding how language constructs and perpetuates certain ideas. Next, the cognitive component gets into what's going on inside individuals' minds. It looks at how these discourse structures reflect underlying, socially shared prejudices and racist ideologies. Essentially, it helps us interpret why certain language patterns emerge based on what people believe and think subconsciously. Finally, the society component explains how all of this, these discourses and beliefs, serve a function in maintaining ethnic domination and inequality. It shows how dominant groups, often white majorities, use these language patterns intentionally or unintentionally to reinforce their power over minority groups. This approach, Van Dijk's sociocognitive model, is really about seeing the big picture, how language, thought, and society are interconnected in the reproduction of social inequalities. It helps us understand not just what is being said, but why it's said and how it sustains unequal power relations. Let's take a closer look at the hidden hand of power in discourse. First, the ideological nature of discourse means that it's never neutral. It always has an underlying agenda. This agenda tends to serve the interests of particular groups, often at the expense of others. So, when we analyze discourse, we're also uncovering how power is maintained and reinforced through language. Next, we see how racist ideologies often organize themselves through a polarized representation, what we call us versus them. In this framing, the in-group is depicted with positive traits, while the out-group is characterized negatively. This clear dichotomy helps solidify social boundaries and justify unequal treatment. Now, it's important to note that the workings of ideology are most effective when they're least visible. When these ideas become invisible, they seem natural and obvious, making it much harder to challenge or question them. That's why ideology's subtlety is a powerful tool. Finally, we come to naturalization. When ideological assumptions become normalized, when they're embedded in what we call common sense, they are institutionalized as part of our everyday conventions. This process sustains existing power relations because it makes these assumptions seem like just the way things are. In fact, naturalization is often regarded as the most formidable weapon in the armor of power because it deeply influences how we perceive the world without us even realizing it. All of these points connect to our broader theme, understanding how discourse not only reflects, but actively constructs and maintains social power. Let's talk about the power behind discourse. First, we see that dominant control lies with the so-called symbolic elites. These are the people who control the means of communication, such as politicians, mass media, academia, and education. Because they have privileged access to public discourse, they can indirectly influence people's minds and shape their ideologies. Next, Van Dijk's work highlights something really important: the subtle discursive dimensions of elite racism. Often, this form of racism isn't overt or obvious. Instead, it appears in what might seem like respectable or acceptable language used by the elites. This demonstrates how racism can be embedded in everyday discourse without being immediately obvious. We also need to understand the role of the political domain. It's a crucial space because it determines who can legally enter a country and is where both racist and anti-racist ideologies are expressed and debated. This shows how discourse in politics directly impacts policies and social realities. All of this points to a broader idea: discourse is fundamental to institutionalization. It helps us create and maintain certain definitions of reality. Through language, the elites help shape what is considered normal, acceptable, or true in society. Finally, when we talk about elite discourse, it's essential to see how it reproduces racism. The language used by elites doesn't just reflect existing prejudices. It actively reproduces and perpetuates racial inequalities. So, understanding these discursive processes is key to addressing and challenging systemic racism at its core. Now, let's take a closer look at Van Dijk's 7 Ds of discrimination, which helps us understand how racism is enacted and manifested in everyday interactions. These actions often happen at the micro level. Think of conversations, gestures, or subtle cues. that play a crucial role in reproducing and sustaining discriminatory ideologies. Van Dijk identifies 7 key categories that organize both discursive and non-discursive actions against minority members. First, we have dominance which is about asserting power and superiority over others. Then there's differentiation where distinctions are made that emphasize differences, often to marginalize. Next is distance where the dominant group seeks to create social or psychological space from minorities. Diffusion involves spreading discriminatory ideas across different contexts, making them seem normal or acceptable. Diversion redirects attention away from issues of discrimination, often to avoid confrontation. Depersonalization or destruction reduces individuals to stereotypes or attacks their identity, stripping away their personhood. Lastly, daily discrimination refers to the routine, often subtle, acts of bias that accumulate over time. All of these categories show how language and behavior enact discrimination, reinforcing harmful stereotypes and power imbalances. This connects to our overall theme, how discourse, whether spoken or unspoken, shapes social realities and sustains inequality. Understanding these categories helps us recognize the often subtle, yet persistent ways discrimination persists in daily interactions. Today, I want to talk about how constructions of difference, deviance, and threat form part of a broader discursive strategy rooted in racist ideology. Essentially, this strategy often involves presenting a positive image of the white, original group while portraying others, such as immigrants, refugees, and minorities, in a negative light. People tend to construct discourse about the other in 3 main ways. First, there's the focus on difference, highlighting that the other is not like us. This emphasis on differences, however, can quickly shift into emphasizing deviance, where the other is seen as behaving in ways that are considered morally wrong or abnormal. Next, we have the portrayal of deviance or transgression. Here, the other is depicted as engaging in behaviors that are considered amoral or as not fitting into our norms and values, things like criminal activity, reliance on social benefits, or cultural practices that are viewed as deviant. Finally, there's the idea of threat. This involves framing the other as dangerous, sometimes as waves or invaders, threatening the country, or as a menace to Western values and way of life. Understanding these strategies is crucial because they serve to justify exclusion, discrimination, and even hostility. They are powerful tools that reinforce negative stereotypes and sustain racist ideologies by painting the other as fundamentally different, deviant, or threatening. So, in summary, these 3 constructions, difference, deviance, and threat, are interconnected. They form a discursive pattern that consistently works to position the other as undesirable and dangerous, supporting the overall narrative of division and racialization. Now let's look at some common discursive techniques used in racist talk. First, we have racist disclaimers. These are phrases like, "I have nothing against immigrants, but," which might sound harmless at first, but they often serve as a way to justify negative opinions that follow. Essentially, they help create a positive self-image while still expressing prejudice. Next, topicalization is a key strategy. This involves making certain information more prominent, like in headlines, to highlight our good qualities or their bad qualities. Interestingly, when it comes to our own racism, it's often detopicalized, meaning it's left vague or general, avoiding direct attribution. Then there's lexical polarization. This technique uses specific words to draw a clear divide. For example, describing us as normal, modern, tolerant, and intelligent, while portraying them as strange, traditional, or backward, intolerant, aggressive, and even criminal. It's a powerful way to reinforce us versus them narratives. Finally, we see metaphorical framing. This is where metaphors are used to shape perceptions negatively. For instance, describing immigrants as flooding, the country evokes a loss of control, painting immigration as an overwhelming and problematic influx. All these techniques, disclaimers, topicalization, polarization, metaphors, are discursive strategies that work together to shape and reinforce racist narratives. They're subtle but impactful ways language can influence attitudes and perceptions. Let's explore the discursive construction of who we are. First, it's important to understand that our ethnicity is not fixed or static. Instead, our identity is emergent and negotiated through specific encounters and social interactions. Next, consider linguistic indexing. People often signal their ethnicity through the language or dialect they choose to use. But it's crucial to recognize that the link between language and ethnicity is quite complex and can be challenged or misunderstood. Moving on to self-construction, this involves enacting our identity by also attributing identities to others. For example, when someone enacts a racist identity, they are often constructing an inferior identity for people of another race by comparing or contrasting it with their own. Finally, there's the process of differentiation. Our identity construction involves distinguishing ourselves from others, describing our own group while simultaneously separating from others. All of these points connect to the larger theme of how race, identity, and otherness are fluid and socially constructed processes. They highlight that our sense of who we are is shaped through ongoing conversations and social positioning. Let's talk about how language can be a powerful tool for challenging dominance. First, we have transformative discourse. While discourse often helps maintain the status quo, it also has the potential to challenge and change it. By shaping conversations, we can either reinforce or transform social structures. Next, discursive resistance is about dominated groups pushing back against oppressive power. This can take the form of opposing dominant narratives or challenging established conventions, allowing marginalized voices to be heard and recognized. Then, there's the idea of reclaiming terms. Words that were once used to demean a group can be reappropriated by that group as symbols of pride and identity. A good example is how African Americans have reclaimed a historically offensive word, transforming it into a marker of resilience and complex human identity. This process of reclamation is a powerful act of agency. Finally, anti-racist ideology relies on discourse to promote equality and justice. Anti-racist conversations oppose racist groups and ideas, fostering values of fairness and inclusion. These forms of resistance through language are crucial in both challenging existing power dynamics and fostering social change. All of these points connect to our overall theme. Language isn't just a reflection of society. It's a tool we can use to challenge, resist, and transform social hierarchies. Let's explore the inequality behind language differences. Critical race theory, or CRT, provides a useful lens here. It helps us understand how race, racism, and racialization intersect with issues of language, belonging, and identity. This means that when we look at language use, we're also looking at broader social and racial dynamics that influence how people are perceived and treated. Next, there's the concept of linguistic subordination. This refers to how the language variety of a marginalized group is often itself marginalized. In other words, discrimination based on language is frequently a mask for deeper social and racial inequalities. It's important to recognize that these language judgments aren't just about words or pronunciation. They're tied to social biases and power structures. Now, a key point here is the focus on form rather than content. For example, judging someone's character or intelligence based on a dialect feature, like pronouncing ask as ax, reflects more about social stereotypes than about the individual's abilities. This shows us that attitudes toward language are deeply connected to social identity, not just linguistic features themselves. Finally, we should consider the human rights aspect. Language subordination essentially strips people of a fundamental human right, the right to speak freely in their mother tongue without fear or intimidation. So, in the broader context of our presentation, these issues highlight how language is not just a tool for communication, but also a site of social justice and inequality. Understanding this helps us see why addressing language bias is crucial in creating a more equitable society. Let's take a closer look at the sites of reproduction for racism in public and media discourse. First, media analysis plays a crucial role here. Critical research shows how racism is often reproduced through media coverage, especially when it comes to immigrants and minorities. Media tends to focus on a stereotypical set of negative topics, such as crime and cultural deviance, which reinforces harmful biases. Next, we examine political discourse, particularly among elites. Parliamentary debates are a key site where white dominance can be reproduced. Politicians often use persuasive strategies, like positive self-presentation, to express anti-immigrant attitudes subtly or overtly. Then, we come to alternative voices. It's vital to listen to minority groups' accounts of racist events. These stories help us understand how dominant strategies are challenged, interpreted, and resisted. They reveal how prejudice, discrimination, and racism manifest in real-life experiences. Overall, these sites, media, political discourse, and minority voices, are interconnected in shaping how racism persists and is challenged in society. Recognizing this complexity is essential in our broader effort to understand and combat racism everywhere. Now, let's delve into the institutional reproduction of inequality. Educational tracking, when combined with ethnographic work and critical discourse analysis, helps us understand how institutional and societal power, including institutionalized racism, is reproduced within educational settings. Specifically, it reveals how educational tracking is often carried out discursively, meaning through language and social practices that reinforce existing inequalities. Next, we see classrooms functioning as linguistic contact zones, where different languages and dialects interact and sometimes clash. This often happens through the insistence on standard English, which can devalue other linguistic varieties, and through the imposition of middle-class cultural and linguistic norms. Essentially, these contact zones can perpetuate power imbalances by privileging certain language practices over others. Moving on to textbooks, research shows that they frequently either ignore immigrant students altogether or perpetuate stereotypes and even racist prejudices. This contributes to a limited and often biased representation of diverse groups, reinforcing societal inequalities. Finally, there's the importance of developing a critical pedagogy around language instruction. Educators need to recognize that classrooms can either sustain existing inequalities or serve as spaces for change. By engaging in critical language study, teachers can help diminish inequality and foster more inclusive, equitable learning environments. All these points tie back to our overall theme: understanding how racism and inequality are embedded in educational structures and practices, and what we can do to challenge and transform them. Let's take a moment to reflect on the power of language, power, and social change. Critical discourse analysis is a valuable tool because it helps us uncover the hidden interests, values, and power relations woven into the texts and conversations we encounter every day. By doing so, we can see how language plays a role in sustaining social inequalities, often without us realizing it. Now, the choices we make in language, our words, our tone, our attitudes, are never neutral. They carry power, and that power can either reinforce or challenge cultural hierarchies. For example, the way we speak about different groups can either elevate or diminish their social capital. Recognizing this is crucial if we want to be agents of change. So, what's our call to action? We need to deepen our own understanding of language and help our students do the same. We should be vigilant about exposing language that promotes hatred or mockery, because these words often mask deeper racial or social issues. It's also essential to adopt a constantly critical perspective towards our own practices and assumptions. That includes examining how factors like class, race, gender, and ethnicity influence our perspectives and actions. Ultimately, this ongoing critical work is about being active participants in social transformation. By scrutinizing our language and challenging its underlying power structures, we can contribute to a more just and equitable society.